A body lies cold at the end of a forgotten corridor. No one saw who passed through last. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Let's grow this mystery-loving crew. Comment where you're watching from. I'm always thrilled to see this community light up the comments. Now, let's uncover the truth. It was nearly 5 o'clock when Maigret stepped out of the café near Place de Clichy, the small blue sign above the door rattling softly in the wind behind him. He hadn't gone in for anything important, just a coffee, perhaps more for the ritual than the taste. The rain was light but persistent, the sort that seemed to settle into the wool of his coat and live there for days. He lit a cigarette under the awning, shielding the match with the thick palm of his hand, and exhaled with a tired grunt as the flame danced out. There was nothing unusual about the afternoon. Not yet. He was supposed to be heading home. Madame Maigret had planned a blanquette de veau, and she had reminded him twice, almost shyly, that the butcher had finally received the good cuts. But Maigret lingered, his collar upturned, staring out into the grey wash of the street, as Parisians hurried under umbrellas that bobbed like black mushrooms. A boy passed with a bundle of evening papers under one arm, the ink running on the top pages. A man followed, holding his hat in place against the wind. There was a smell in the air that Maigret recognized, not just wet stone or car exhaust, but something faint and coppery, a smell of basements, old water. He couldn't place it. He dropped the cigarette in a puddle and crossed the street slowly, his heavy shoes slapping on the wet stones. Not toward home. Not yet. Something, he couldn't say what, had unsettled him. By the time he reached the mouth of Rue des Deux Ponts, the rain had thickened to a drizzle. The buildings there leaned in close, as if sharing secrets overhead. A concierge's cat sat watching him from under a wrought-iron fence, its fur slick with rain, unmoving. Maigret paused in front of a small bakery with its shutters down. He wasn't looking at the shop, but at the window 2 floors above, the glass slightly open, a pale curtain trembling. Nothing dramatic, nothing official, just a detail, just something that had not been there the day before, when he'd walked this same path without thinking. His feet turned on their own. He made a small sound in his throat, a grunt of mild curiosity or resignation. Across the street stood a narrow stone building with a courtyard visible through a rusting gate, a place he hadn't thought of in years. "Maigret?" someone called behind him, a voice dry and surprised. He turned. It was old Doctor Fargeau, his raincoat too thin, carrying a brown paper sack with 2 leaks poking out. The doctor squinted behind thick lenses. "Strange to see you here." "Is it?" Maigret said softly, his breath visible now. "You're retired now, aren't you?" Fargeau asked. "Or is that just gossip?" "Not officially," Maigret replied, "but close enough." They stood there, rain threading between them like invisible wire. "There's a smell," the doctor said suddenly, frowning toward the building behind Maigret. "Like rot. I mentioned it to the concierge yesterday. She thought it was just drains." Maigret looked back toward the rusted gate. A stone corridor led inward. A corridor he remembered from a case long buried, not in records but in mood. Something had happened there, years ago. He had forgotten the names, but not the feeling. "I was just passing," Maigret murmured. It was only half a lie. Dr. Fargeau adjusted the paper sack, his knuckles pale. "The residents say the smell is stronger near the far end of the corridor. You know how old buildings breathe." Maigret didn't answer. He was already walking through the gate, the iron groaning softly as he nudged it open. The corridor yawned before him, damp stone, gaslight flickering at intervals, and the echo of dripping somewhere deep inside. He did not need to be a detective anymore. He was simply a man who followed unease. Behind him, Dr. Fargeau did not follow. Maigret heard the old man cough, then walk away, muttering about soup and bones, and how rain brought back every ache. Maigret moved slowly, as if descending into memory. His hand brushed the wall cool and slick. A second window, halfway down, was cracked open, its sill dark with water. He paused there, looking in. Nothing. At the end of the corridor, past a stack of broken crates and a child's forgotten ball, something glinted. He moved closer and stopped. There, half shielded by an old blanket and a toppled crate of empty wine bottles, lay a shoe, a woman's shoe, black, patent leather, the kind worn for dinners that are expected to end early. It was attached to a foot. Maigret did not move. He took out his pipe, unlit, and held it in his hand like an old habit. He wasn't surprised. Not exactly. He was only cold, and aware now that he would not be home in time for Blanquette de Veau. He turned slowly and walked back into the rain. The mood had changed, not because a body had been found, but because the city had exhaled something it had kept hidden, something Maigret, without knowing it, had come looking for. Not officially, but emotionally. Maigret returned through the gate with the same heaviness he had entered, though now the weight felt justified. He did not hurry. The rain stitched quietly against his shoulders. At the entrance to the stone corridor, he paused and drew out his handkerchief, wiping his brow, though it was the air, not his skin, that sweated. The concierge was not at her desk. A cracked bell sat on the counter, untouched, beside an ashtray half full of lipstick-smudged cigarette butts. A calendar behind the desk displayed the wrong month, May, though it was already June. The kind of detail that told him more than any confession. He took the narrow stairs 2 at a time, not out of haste, but rhythm. His legs remembered this building, its uneven rise, the hollow sound the 5th step made. He reached the 2nd floor and turned right, toward the open window he had noticed from the street. The curtain inside had stilled now, wet at the hem. Maigret rapped gently on the door beside the window. Nothing. He knocked again, louder. Still silence. He waited. 1, 2, 3 seconds. Then he turned the knob. It moved without resistance. The apartment was dim, with that distinct smell of long-boiled cabbage and linoleum, warmed by decades of footsteps. There were lace doilies on every surface, the kind his wife collected from markets, but never quite used. The room felt paused, not lived in. A framed photograph faced the wrong way on a mantel. He turned it carefully. A woman, middle-aged, heavy-set, with narrowed eyes and too much powder on her nose. Beside her a man in uniform, navy perhaps, or police. Maigret studied the insignia, then replaced the frame gently. A kettle sat cold on the stove. No one had cooked here today. He opened the small icebox and found half a loaf of bread, 3 eggs, a jar of mustard. No meat, not even cheese. Just enough to say one lived alone and made no effort to entertain. He left the apartment as quietly as he'd entered and returned to the lobby. This time, the concierge was at her post, a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders, despite the warmth. "Excuse me, madame," Maigret said with his usual courtesy. "I believe we've met before. Years ago, Inspector Maigret." Her eyes narrowed. "Yes, I remember now. You were here when there was trouble on the 4th floor." "That's right," Maigret said. "I didn't expect to return, but I need to ask, when did you first smell it?" She gave a little shrug, more with her lips than her shoulders. 3 days, maybe 4. I thought it was just the drains again. That happens when the storms come." "Did anyone report a tenant missing?" "No one says much anymore. The ones that used to gossip have all died or moved. These days they mind their own." She reached for a tin of mints and offered him one. He declined. "Who lives at the end of the corridor?" he asked, careful not to name the body yet. Her hand stilled. "That apartment's been vacant for almost a month. The girl who rented it, Odette. She left suddenly. I thought she'd gone south. She talked about Nice. Odette, Maigret repeated. Young? 25, maybe. Hair like straw, always done up with pins. Always wore gloves, even in summer. Said they were her mother's. Maigret nodded, filing it away. Had many visitors? One, the concierge said, after a pause too long to be forgetful. A man, older, balding, always wore a coat, no matter the weather. He never stayed long and never spoke to anyone. I only saw them together once, and that was through the window. They didn't look happy. Maigret thanked her and stepped back out into the rain. The patrol officers were already arriving, 2 of them, young and nervous. They recognized him and straightened their backs unnecessarily. We'll need to secure the corridor, he said quietly, and I want photographs taken before anything is touched. Yes, Chief. Maigret didn't correct them. By now, word had begun to ripple through the building, the way it always did. Muffled footsteps overhead, the faint creak of floorboards, the tightening of blinds. The residents would become quieter, not louder. That was the nature of these buildings. They hushed themselves in the presence of secrets. He stood at the mouth of the corridor again, staring down toward the half-shielded body. He had not yet seen her face, and had no desire to. Not until the photographer had captured everything untouched. The smell was stronger now, the air heavier, but beneath it was something else. A perfume, perhaps. Cheap and floral, already fading. He watched the crime-scene men move like ghosts, their breath visible in the damp corridor. They said nothing. Good. Silence did more than questions ever could. Maigret returned to the street for a moment of cleaner air. A bakery had opened nearby, and the scent of warm bread cut through the morning's decay. He lit his pipe, not because he wanted to smoke, but because he needed the feel of it in his hand, the warmth, the ritual. "Excuse me," said a voice behind him. A woman, older. She wore a green coat that had once been stylish, now rubbed bare at the cuffs. "Yes?" Maigret asked, turning. "I heard about the girl. Was it Odette?" "We don't know yet," he said softly. "But you knew her?" "I lived across from her. Not close, just across. I heard things sometimes. Music, arguments. Nothing strange. But 3 nights ago, I heard shouting. Around midnight. A man's voice. Angry. Then the door slammed. And then... nothing. Did you see the man?" "Number. But I'd heard him before. Twice, maybe 3 times. Always after dark." "Would you be willing to describe the voice?" The woman nodded, eyes glassy. Gravelly. Low, but not old. Like someone who didn't speak much and resented needing to. Maigret watched her face. She wasn't lying. And she wasn't embellishing. He thanked her and returned to the building. Inside, the body was being prepared for removal. The photographer had finished. Carefully, Maigret knelt, finally lifting the edge of the blanket. She was young. Perhaps not even 25. Her hair, no longer straw blonde but dulled by the damp, had been pinned with care. Her gloved hands rested stiffly by her sides. Her face was calm, not distorted by fear or violence. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, just a small purplish mark on her neck, too round for coincidence. He stood slowly. This was not an accident, and it had not been a crime of passion. Someone had wanted her quiet, forgotten. But Maigret remembered her now, and that meant the silence would not last. Maigret stood in the stone corridor long after the body had been taken away. The scent still lingered, not just of decay, but of absence, the kind of stillness that follows after something final has occurred. The silence of the place pressed against his ears like damp cotton. He listened anyway. One of the patrolmen returned with a clipboard, shoes squeaking faintly on the wet floor. "Chief, sorry, Inspector. We've got her identification. The building's tenant records list her as Odette Mercier, 24, moved in 5 months ago, paid 3 months in advance and then monthly. No listed place of employment. Maigret accepted the clipboard and scanned the sparse lines. Her handwriting was small, tilted right. There was no emergency contact. He walked back out into the open air, where the rain had thinned to a soft mist. Across the street, the windows blinked like watchful eyes. A girl like Odette didn't live in such a place unless she had nowhere better. The address suggested not roots, but drift. He returned to the concierge's window. She was busying herself with the same paper stack, still pretending to read the same page as when he'd last seen her. She didn't look up. "Did Odette ever receive mail here?" Maigret asked. The concierge kept her eyes on the newspaper. "Not much. A couple of letters. One envelope had perfume on it. You could smell it from across the room." He tilted his head. "From a man? I wouldn't know." She lifted her chin slightly. But the handwriting was florid, not like a man's. Maigret made no remark, just noted it quietly. "And her rent? Who collected it?" "I did. She paid in cash. Never late. Always exact. Never chatted." He nodded and walked away, letting the silence linger long enough to make her squirm. Before he reached the door, she called after him. "She had a visitor last week, Thursday. I didn't see him arrive, but I saw him leave. Around 10 at night." He paused, but didn't turn. "Did she seem upset afterward?" "She didn't come out again. Not even to collect the milk bottles the next morning." The corridor darkened behind his eyes again. That small, stiff figure on the stone, a girl who stopped collecting her milk. At the Quai des Orfèvres, later that afternoon, Maigret sat in his old office, though it no longer officially belonged to him. The room had been emptied of personal touches months ago. No pipe rack, no old calendar from the brewer in Alsace. But his coat still fit the hook, and his name still lived in the memory of the walls. Lucas stepped in without knocking, younger than when Maigret first took him on, but now carrying a shadow of his own under the eyes. "The preliminary report's in," he said, setting a thin file on the desk. "Cause of death is strangulation. Blunt trauma to the neck, no sign of external wounds, no struggle marks on her hands. She didn't fight." Maigret lit his pipe slowly. "So she knew him?" Lucas nodded. "Most likely. She trusted him, enough to let him get close. No sign of forced entry?" "None. Door was intact. Windows locked from the inside." Maigret puffed once, then again. The room filled with the familiar sweet haze. "And no one saw anyone leave the building afterward?" Lucas hesitated. "We canvassed. One man, lives across the courtyard, says he saw a figure in a grey overcoat leaving around midnight, but he couldn't make out the face. Said the man didn't look hurried, walked as if he belonged." "Grey overcoat," Maigret repeated softly. "Always the same." "Sir?" Maigret waved the thought away. He was remembering another corridor. Another man with calm footsteps. He stood abruptly. "Get me her telephone records. If she didn't work, someone was supporting her. Someone who didn't want to be named. And what about the man the concierge saw last week?" "We'll start there." Maigret paused. "She said he wore a coat even when it was warm. Balding. Quiet. It sounds like he's done this before." Lucas opened his notebook. "We'll get a sketch drawn up." Maigret nodded, but his eyes were distant. It wasn't the description that stayed with him. It was the gloves. A girl who wore gloves indoors in summer and said they were her mother's. He had seen that before too. The compulsive dignity of someone who had been ashamed of their hands. "She came from somewhere," Maigret murmured. "Somewhere she didn't talk about." Lucas tilted his head. "Think she was running?" "No," Maigret said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I think she was hiding. There's a difference." That night, Maigret didn't go home. He called his wife to apologize. She didn't ask why. She only told him the stew could wait and to remember his coat. She had known long ago that he wouldn't leave such cases half-solved. By 10 o'clock, he was back on Rue des Deux Ponts, walking its edge like a man retracing a ghost's steps. The windows were darker now, A few glowed faintly with television light. Others stared out empty. He didn't go inside the building. Instead, he circled to the alley behind it, narrow and damp, with bins lined like hunched beggars. Rats scattered ahead of him. There was a broken bottle, a scarf soaked in mud, and a cigarette stub ground into the stone. The lipstick on it was not red, but a soft pink. Faded, faint, familiar. Maigret pocketed it without a word. Something stirred above. A curtain twitched. A man watched him from a third-floor window, his face half-shadowed, unmoving. Maigret met his gaze, held it, then tipped his head once. The man disappeared behind the curtain. Maigret walked back to the main street, pipe in hand, steps slow. He wasn't sure what he had found yet, only that something was beginning to shape itself. A girl in gloves, a man in a grey overcoat, a building where no one talked unless they had to. The corpse at the end of the stone corridor wasn't just a murder. It was the last word in a long, quiet conversation someone had hoped would never be overheard. The next morning, a soft grey light filtered through the windows of Maigret's borrowed office at the Quai des Orfèvres. He sat quietly, a fresh pot of coffee growing cold beside him, his pipe resting in the deep groove it had worn into his thoughts. The air still carried a hint of last night's rain. Paris, in this hour, felt neither fully awake nor asleep, the kind of in-between moment Maigret trusted more than any witness statement. Lucas arrived just after 8, coat still wet at the shoulders. He handed over a manila envelope without speaking, waiting for Maigret to read before offering interpretation. Inside were the preliminary phone records from Odette's line, sparse but not empty. A dozen short calls, most of them local, some unreturned. One number repeated 3 times over the past 2 weeks, always between 7 and 8 in the evening. The most recent was 3 days before the body was found. Maigret tapped the edge of the envelope absently. "Who's the subscriber?" Lucas flipped his notebook. A rooming house in the 11th arrondissement. Registered to a Jean Renault. No listed profession, cash payer, no police record. Maigret didn't look up. No record doesn't mean much. The careful ones don't leave traces. Lucas shifted. "Want me to go there?" Maigret nodded. "But quietly. Don't make noise unless you must. Just find out what kind of man he is, what he eats, how often he leaves, if he has friends, if he watches people or avoids being seen." Lucas hesitated. "And if he's already gone? Then we learn what he left behind." After Lucas departed, Maigret remained still for a long moment. He ran a fingertip along the rim of his cup, watching the surface tremble. A girl like Odette didn't die from argument or passion. She died from someone who thought she could disappear quietly. That kind of death carried a logic of its own. By 10, Maigret found himself walking slowly along Rue de Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the sidewalks growing busy with deliveries and the clatter of shutters being drawn up. He wasn't on official business. He wasn't sure what brought him there, except the need to see the rooming house with his own eyes. He trusted his legs more than timetables. The address wasn't hard to find. A pale stone building with rust around the hinges and a vine that had long since stopped blooming. The kind of place where people stayed for short spells, under names not their own. The concierge was thin, grey-haired, and sharp-eyed. She recognized Maigret for what he was before he spoke, but said nothing. He asked about Jean Renault. "Tall man," she said, after a bewildered moment. "Always quiet. Paid early, never asked for towels, smoked too much, left 2 days ago." Maigret tilted his head. "Did he say where he was going?" "Didn't say anything, just handed me the key. No suitcase, just the clothes on his back and a paper parcel under one arm." She stepped aside, almost reluctantly, and let Maigret walk up the narrow staircase. The room was on the 2nd floor, small, bare, the kind of emptiness that wasn't only physical. No signs of rush, but no signs of life either. the mattress uncreased, the basin dry, the curtain pulled at a careful angle. The air smelled faintly of shaving soap and tobacco. Maigret opened the closet. Nothing. The drawer in the bedside table yielded only a folded piece of paper tucked behind the lining. He slipped it free. One name, written in blue ink. Odette. No last name. No address. Just the name, underlined once, as if to make it real. Back at the station, Lucas was waiting. He worked at a watch repair shop once, briefly. Owner said he had good hands, but too many silences. Said he left after 3 months. No warning. Never came back. Maigret nodded, folding his coat over the back of the chair. Did Odette ever mention him to anyone? Not that we know, but one neighbor says she sometimes left the building at night, wearing full makeup, gloves, and a scarf over her head. Said she looked like she didn't want to be seen. Always walked toward the Seine. A meeting point, then, Maigret said softly. Someplace quiet. Lucas exhaled. Why do they choose places like that? Because quiet places promise not to remember, Maigret said. That afternoon, Maigret walked the stretch between Odette's building and the riverbank, imagining her steps, measured, cautious, too deliberate to be casual. There were benches facing the water where the city forgot to be grand. One of them, near a footbridge, bore a faint cigarette burn on the armrest. He sat there. For a while, nothing happened. Just pigeons pecking at crumbs, a distant barge groaning as it passed beneath the arches. Then he saw her. Not Odette, but someone watching the same spot Maigret was watching. A woman, maybe in her 30s, with short dark hair and a nervous posture. She stood near the trees, pretending to read a leaflet from a newsstand, but her eyes kept lifting, scanning. Maigret waited until she lowered the leaflet again. Then he rose and approached without hurry. I used to sit here with someone, he said calmly, stopping a few feet away. She wore gloves, blonde hair, quiet voice. Do you remember her? The woman froze. A breath hitched. Then she shook her head. Maigret didn't push. He simply nodded and turned to walk away. But her voice came, low and tremulous. She called him René. That wasn't his real name. Maigret stopped. Did you ever see them together? Once, she whispered. He scared me. Not because he shouted. He never did. He just stared. Too long. Like he was memorizing people. Like he was waiting for them to slip. Maigret turned to face her fully. Did you tell anyone? She shook her head again. Who would listen? Odette never asked for help. She said he had changed. She believed it. Maigret took out his notebook. What's your name? Céline. Would you be willing to speak at the station? She hesitated, then nodded. That evening, back at the quay, Maigret sat alone in the interview room, the dim light painting long shadows across the table. The photo of Odette rested before him, untouched. Her face, even in stillness, was guarded. He stared at it for a long time. They had a name now, René. Not legal, but real enough in its intimacy. And somewhere, a man walked in a grey overcoat with a paper parcel under his arm, certain that the world would not remember a girl in gloves. But Maigret remembered, and that was enough to begin. That night, Maigret walked home through streets slick with rain and silence. He passed shuttered shops and puddles that reflected gaslight like quiet ghosts. His collar was turned up against the chill, but he didn't hurry. His thoughts stayed with the woman at the river, Céline, and her voice, trembling not from fear, but from the memory of someone else's. He found Madame Maigret in the kitchen, rinsing teacups. She looked up with a small, knowing smile she saved for evenings like this. You ate? He shook his head. There's soup on the stove, warm enough. He sat, letting the smell of leeks and pepper settle over him. She didn't ask about the case. She rarely did. But as she placed the bowl in front of him, she said, almost casually, Your shoes are still damp. Don't leave them near the fire. They'll warp." He gave a soft grunt of agreement. They sat in the quiet, the spoon tapping the edge of the bowl, the window rattling gently in the wind. At last she said, "You have that look again, the one you had when the girl disappeared from the Rue Saint-Louis." Maigret didn't answer, but he reached for her hand and gave it a brief, absent squeeze. The same girl, in a way. Different name. Same kind of vanishing. He returned to the station early the next morning. Céline was already there, waiting in a plain coat and gloves that didn't match. She looked as though she hadn't slept. Maigret brought her into the smallest room, more comfortable than official. He offered her coffee. She took it without sugar, her hands tight around the cup. "I don't know where to start," she said. "Anywhere," Maigret said. "Just tell me what you remember." Céline glanced down. "Odette moved into our building in January. She never said where she came from, only that she was starting over. She said it like someone reading from a note, rehearsed. At first I thought she was a dancer, or maybe worked at a theatre. She moved like someone who used to perform." Maigret nodded, encouraging her, with silence. "She kept to herself mostly, but we sometimes shared a pot of tea in the evening. She didn't talk much, but when she did, she talked about him. Not directly, just the edges. She called him René, but I don't think she meant to say his name aloud." "Did she ever say how they met?" "Only once. She said they'd met when she was working somewhere else, another city. She never said which, just that he found her again, that he followed her, but not like a stalker, like someone with a key." "A key to what?" "To her fear," Céline whispered. He knew which words would make her tremble. He didn't have to hit her, just make her feel small. Maigret made a small mark in his notebook. "You said you saw them together once." "It was 2 weeks ago. I was coming home late. I saw them at the far end of the corridor. He had her wrist in his hand, not hurting her, just holding her still. She looked straight at me. Not for help, just to be seen." "And he?" "He didn't flinch. He just turned and left. Calm. She stayed behind, leaned against the wall as if she'd run a mile. That's when I began to worry." "You didn't go to the police?" "I didn't think it was my place," Céline said, her voice low with shame. She made it seem like, if anyone interfered, it would only make things worse. Maigret looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You were right to come now. We may still be in time." She nodded, but her eyes didn't believe it. After she left, Maigret returned to his office and placed a call to a small precinct just outside Rouen. He spoke with a sergeant he'd once shared a case with and asked a question that had been forming in the corners of his mind for days. "Do you remember a case," he said, "involving a man named Jean Renaud? Or perhaps he used René? A girl disappeared, quietly. No charges, no body." The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment. Then, "We had one like that, 3 years ago. Girl's name was Léonie. Pretty, quiet. Family said she left town, but we had suspicions. What happened? Nothing. She vanished. He left town the same week. Never found either of them again." Maigret thanked him and hung up. He sat back, rubbing his temples. The pattern was becoming clear. The girl from Rouen. Now Odette. Always quiet girls. Always short leases. Always a man who left without noise. Lucas entered with a stack of papers and a look that said he'd been thinking too. "I think I found his real name," Lucas said. "Henri Delatour, 47. Used aliases in Lyon and Tours. Minor fraud charges, never stuck. 1 police report. Domestic complaint filed in 1954 by a woman named Émilie Varneau. She withdrew it before it reached court. Said she'd made a mistake. Do we know where she is now?" Lucas shook his head. "She hasn't been seen in years. Her last known address was burned down in a fire 2 winters ago. The Neighbors say she left town. Maigret exhaled slowly, or was made to. Lucas sat down. He's a drifter with charm, a man who knows how to fold himself into quiet spaces. That's why no one notices him until someone ends up gone. Maigret stood and walked to the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. A city of 1,000,000 windows, and one man slipping through them like a shadow. He doesn't run, Maigret said. He fades. He becomes someone else. But there's always a trace, always a pattern. And Odette, she was the last? Maigret shook his head. She was the one who hesitated, who began to pull away. He must have sensed it. That's why he killed her. Lucas rose. What now? We find him. Not as a name, but as a man. He'll be somewhere nearby, not far. Men like him always watch their work. That night, Maigret returned to the bench by the river. The sky had cleared, and the water shimmered with a sheen of gold from the street lamps. He sat without speaking, the shape of the investigation now full in his mind. He did not need to chase Henri Delatour. He only had to wait. The river was quiet at that hour, as if it too had grown tired of carrying secrets. Maigret sat motionless on the bench beneath the footbridge, the bowl of his pipe unlit in his hand. Around him, the city whispered, the faint splash of water against the stone embankment, the soft rattle of leaves in the breeze, the distant clink of a bottle knocked over by a stray cat. He waited, not for a figure to appear, but for something subtler, a sense of presence, a disturbance in stillness, the faint pulse of guilt that always circled back to the scene. The wind shifted, bringing with it a trace of tobacco smoke, not his own. Maigret didn't move. He listened. The scent grew stronger, coming from behind, from somewhere near the row of benches that faced the water. Not enough to be deliberate, just enough to be careless. He let another minute pass before rising. He walked without hurry toward the scent, glancing only once over his shoulder. A man sat hunched beneath a tree, coat collar high, a newspaper folded stiffly in his hands. He looked straight ahead, but Maigret knew that posture, the artificial stillness of someone pretending not to watch. Maigret approached, stopping beside the bench without speaking. The man flicked the ashes of his cigarette and kept his eyes on the water. "You're late," Maigret said quietly. The man gave no reaction, but his fingers twitched just once, folding the newspaper tighter. Maigret sat beside him, close enough to feel the man's tension. "I thought you might come sooner," Maigret continued, "but then I realized you're not the type to check your work the next day. You wait. You let things settle. You let the city forget." Still, the man said nothing, but Maigret saw it now, the hollow beneath the cheekbones, the careful way he avoided looking directly. The kind of face people forget 5 minutes after passing it. "I've spoken to people," Maigret said. "Women, one from Rouen, another from Tours. They all remember you, though they never knew your name. You called yourself René once, Henri another time. Maybe you're someone else now. Doesn't matter. They all remember what you left behind." The man finally spoke, voice low, almost lazy. "You can't prove anything." "I don't need to," Maigret said calmly. "Not yet. I just need to understand." A silence stretched between them. Then the man laughed, short and dry. "You think this is about understanding?" "I don't think it's about anything else," Maigret replied. "You don't kill for money. You don't kill from rage. You kill to make things disappear, quietly, without scene. You think if you leave no noise behind, it's as if nothing happened." The man lit another cigarette, his hands steady now. "She was going to talk," he said at last. "She said she was done being afraid." Maigret nodded. "That frightened you more than losing her." He didn't answer. The breeze shifted again. The water glimmered gold and black beneath the bridge. Maigret didn't need a confession. He already had the shape of the man's life, not from files, but from the silence he wore like a coat. "She wanted to leave you," Maigret said, "but she hesitated. She thought maybe you'd change. That hesitation cost her life." The man's face remained unreadable, but his jaw set. "She left a name behind," Maigret added. "One name, yours, scrawled on a piece of paper. She didn't sign it, didn't explain it, but it's enough, because the dead don't lie." The man flicked the cigarette into the river and stood. "Are you arresting me?" "Not yet," Maigret said, rising too, "but I think you'll come." They walked side by side in silence, their steps muffled by the damp cobblestones. No cuffs, no hand on the arm, just a quiet return to the world that had been waiting for him. At the station, Lucas was already waiting. His eyes widened slightly when he saw them arrive together, the older man with the distant eyes and the careful gait. Maigret gave a small nod. "Put him in interview 2, he said. "No rush. Let him sit." Lucas led the man away without a word. Maigret sat down at his desk and removed his coat slowly. He reached for his cold coffee and drank it anyway. Then he opened the drawer and took out the photo of Odette. Her eyes still carried that trace of doubt, the shadow of belief that someone, somewhere, might choose not to hurt her. He stared at it for a long moment. Lucas returned. "He's not saying anything, just sitting there." "He won't speak right away," Maigret said. "He's not afraid of being caught. He's afraid of being known." Lucas stood there, uncertain. "Should we press?" Maigret shook his head. "Number, let him sit with himself a while. He's already said more than he meant to." The sky outside the windows had begun to brighten, a slow grey that promised nothing but hours. "Get me a fresh coffee," Maigret murmured. As Lucas stepped out, Maigret leaned back in his chair, letting the room settle into its quiet rhythm. Somewhere in the bowels of the building, a man who changed names like overcoats waited, surrounded not by bars or shouting, but by stillness, the kind that made a man face himself. There would be no trial headlines, no dramatic confrontation, only the slow, inevitable closing of a door behind a man who had spent his life walking through them like mist. And Maigret, pipe in hand, would remain, not satisfied, not triumphant, but still, always, watching the quiet unfold. Maigret waited. Outside the interrogation room, the hallway was quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of a clerk's shoes or the low murmur of someone on the phone behind glass. He didn't pace, didn't fidget. He simply stood with his hands in his pockets, watching the frosted window in the door, where Henri Delatour sat motionless on the other side. There was no clock ticking, but the silence made the minutes feel precise. Lucas returned with the coffee, strong, hot, no sugar, and handed it over wordlessly. He had learned over time that Maigret preferred to speak only when the silence had finished its work. Maigret took a sip, then gestured toward the window. "Has he asked for anything?" "Not a word," Lucas said. "He hasn't moved since he sat down, just stares at the table." "Good," Maigret said. "That means he's thinking. Let's leave him to it." He didn't move to enter. Instead, he sat on the bench opposite the room and waited. It wasn't a strategy. It was a rhythm, a quiet confidence that people spoke when they were ready, and that the truth came not through pressure, but weight. Guilt was like water trapped behind a dam. You didn't need to hammer at it. You just had to wait until the cracks formed. After an hour, Maigret rose and entered the room. Henri Delatour didn't lift his head. His hands were folded in front of him, fingers long and motionless. He was older than the photographs had suggested, the kind of older that settled in the bones first, not the skin. Maigret took the chair opposite, placed his file on the table, and opened it without a word. Inside were photographs, not of the crime scene, but of Odette's apartment, the gloves on the vanity, the makeup set out with quiet care, a small box of costume jewelry, the kind of objects left behind by someone who still thought, right until the end, that life might resume. He turned the photos one by one, letting them lie flat on the table. Still, Delatour said nothing. "She wasn't your first," Maigret said at last, not as a question, but as a certainty. Delatour blinked slowly, eyes still fixed on the edge of the table. "But she may have been the first who looked back at you and didn't flinch. Nothing. You waited," Maigret continued. "You watched her learn how to live without you, and then you decided she didn't have that right." Delatour's hands twitched. The smallest movement. "Enough. She never told anyone what you did. She covered for you. She still thought you might change. That's what killed her. That hope." Delatour finally raised his eyes. They were pale, dry, unreadable. "I loved her." Maigret nodded once, calmly. "I believe you did, in the only way you know how. But your kind of love can't survive freedom. It needs someone quiet, someone who won't leave." Delatour looked down again. Maigret reached into the file and removed a thin, folded letter. It had been found tucked beneath Odette's mattress. A few lines, hastily scrawled, not addressed to anyone. It wasn't a note in the usual sense, more a fragment of thought, a sentence kept secret. "If he finds me again, I won't run, but I won't stay either." Maigret placed it gently on the table. "She'd already made her choice," he said. "It just wasn't loud." Delatour stared at the letter for a long moment. His eyes didn't move, but Maigret saw something shift in the jaw, the kind of tremor a man suppresses by clenching his teeth. "There was no struggle," Maigret said quietly. "You didn't force her. You talked to her, maybe asked her to come back. And when she didn't say yes fast enough, you did what you always do, made sure no one else could have her either." A long silence followed. Then, very softly, Delatour said, "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." "How was it supposed to happen?" Delatour looked up. "I thought, if she saw me again, she'd remember. The good things, the dinners, the way I used to read to her. But she remembered the rest, too." Delatour nodded. "Did you plan it?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "Not at first." Maigret leaned back slightly. "That's the truth of it, isn't it? You never plan to kill. You just wait until someone becomes inconvenient to your version of yourself." Delatour didn't flinch. Maigret closed the file, not with drama, but with a slow, final motion. "You're not a madman. You're not clever either. You're just very patient. You've made a life out of slipping through the cracks. But this time, you left a shape behind. A woman who wore gloves in summer and left your name underlined on a folded scrap of paper. That's all it takes." Delatour exhaled through his nose. "So what happens now?" "You tell me where she is," Maigret said. "The others. The ones who vanished. You know their names." Delatour looked away, not out of defiance, but out of exhaustion. Maigret didn't press. He stood and walked to the door. "She believed you could change," he said. "Don't let her be wrong twice." He stepped out and closed the door behind him. Lucas stood waiting. "Is it done?" Maigret nodded slowly. "He's ready. Bring in a recorder and a clerk. He'll talk." Lucas hesitated. "All of it?" Maigret shrugged. "He has nothing left to protect now." Later that night, Maigret sat at home, a glass of Armagnac in his hand. The house was quiet. Madame Maigret had gone to bed early, leaving the lamp in the corner on for him, as always. He sat in his chair by the window and watched the dark city breathe. He thought of Odette's apartment, the gloves, the soft perfume, the untouched makeup. And he thought of the way her name had lingered longer than her voice. There were no heroes in this story, just a man who waited too long to be stopped, and a girl who left behind a single sentence, folded in fear and resolve. Maigret finished his drink and set the glass down gently. Outside, the river ran on, unchanged. By morning, Paris was grey again, the kind of steady, stubborn grey that neither threatened rain nor promised light. Maigret stood by his office window, the warmth of the radiator at his calves and the scent of old paper mingling with fresh pipe smoke. Outside, the Seine flowed quietly past the embankment, indifferent to what had unfolded in its shadows. Delatour had talked, not dramatically, not even remorsefully. His confession had come in slow, detached fragments, not a story, but a shedding of names. Léonie, Émilie. A girl in Limoges he called "my little Jeanne," though no one could confirm her real name. He spoke of them as though they'd once belonged to him, as if they were chapters in a forgotten book he no longer expected anyone to read. But he remembered details, the shape of their gloves, a song one of them hummed while brushing her hair, where they liked to sit, how they cried when they realized they couldn't leave. Maigret had listened in silence, not for shock, but for patterns, not because the words revealed crimes, but because they revealed him. Lucas entered quietly, a folded report in hand. His expression was neutral but tight, as though he'd spent the night parsing what he'd heard and was still unsure how to carry it. "The team in Rouen confirmed it," he said, laying the paper on the desk. Léonie's family had filed a missing person report 3 years ago. The dates match. They'd given up hope months after. They thought she'd run off with someone. "She did," Maigret said without irony, "just not in the direction they imagined." Lucas paused. "We also found a storage unit Delatour kept under a false name. In Ivry. Paid in cash. Inside were 2 suitcases. One had women's clothing, makeup, an old address book with initials, all consistent with the Rouen girl. The other had letters. From Odette. Torn, some burned at the edges. She must have tried to write to someone. Did she send them? Number stamps were missing. Looks like he intercepted them. Or she never had the courage to post." Maigret nodded. He hadn't expected miracles. "Just confirmations." Lucas hesitated. "What happens now?" "We hand it to the magistrate," Maigret said. "He'll be charged with Odette's murder, possibly Léonie's, maybe more, if we can connect the others. But the rest won't be resolved in court." Lucas frowned. "You mean justice won't be complete?" Maigret shook his head. "Justice is never complete. It's only what's left when the silence is over." He stepped away from the window and began packing the files into a single folder. Not to close the case, that would take months, but to put it somewhere manageable. Something about Delatour made even the paper feel heavier. As he reached the bottom of the pile, he paused. A photograph lay half buried. Odette on a park bench, taken by surveillance just days before her death. She was looking away from the camera, chin tilted slightly up, as if trying to find warmth in a pale sun. There was something unfinished in her posture, as though she had almost said something and changed her mind. Maigret slipped the photo into the inner pocket of his coat. That afternoon, he took the long way home, not through the centre of the city, but along the quiet stretches of the left bank. He walked past closed bookstalls and shuttered cafes, letting the rhythm of his steps match the slow drift of the river beside him. At one of the quieter corners, just beyond a narrow footpath beneath the Pont de la Tournelle, he paused. The bench was still there, the same one where Odette and Delatour had likely sat, where promises had been made or broken. The wood was damp, the iron legs rusted at the base. He sat. For a time, nothing happened. A barge passed, low in the water. 2 boys chased a paper ball along the cobblestones before disappearing behind a wall. The city, as always, carried on. Eventually, a woman approached. Not Céline, but someone older, in her 50s perhaps, with a strong face and grey curls under a worn wool hat. She slowed when she saw Maigret, then sat down beside him without greeting. "I heard he confessed," she said. Her voice was dry, without tremor. Maigret didn't ask how she knew. Word travelled differently in places like Rue des Deux Ponts. Some buildings had their own underground systems of truth. "He said your name," Maigret replied. She nodded. "I was the one who got away." "Emily?" "Yes." She didn't smile, but her mouth softened. "I left before he finished becoming the man who killed." Maigret was quiet. "I tried to report him once," she said. "In Tours. They told me I had no bruises, no proof. They said maybe I was exaggerating. You weren't. I know that now." She looked out at the water, her coat pulled tightly across her chest. "I moved to Paris, changed my name, thought if I made myself small enough, he wouldn't find me again. He didn't." "No," she said softly, "but he found others." Maigret watched the current, felt the weight of her words drift with it. "He won't hurt anyone else," he said. Emily looked at him. "Is that enough?" "No," Maigret admitted. "But it's something." They sat without speaking, two people tethered to the same story from opposite ends. When she finally rose to leave, she looked down at him and said, "Thank you." Maigret offered only a small nod. After she disappeared into the curve of the path, Maigret sat a while longer. Then he stood, turned up his collar, and walked into the fading light. At home that evening, Madame Maigret greeted him with the same gentle ritual. Slippers by the radiator, warm broth on the stove, a small question in her eyes that she didn't voice aloud. He kissed her cheek, set down his hat, and said, "I think I'll sleep well tonight." It wasn't triumph, it wasn't closure, but it was, perhaps, the end of the stone corridor. The next morning brought with it a crisp stillness, the sort that made the city seem briefly new again. A rare clarity hung over the rooftops, the fog having lifted during the night. Maigret walked to the Quai des Orfèvres early, coat unbuttoned, pipe unlit in his pocket. The kind of morning, he thought, where something small might shift, a gesture, a phone call, a glance in the corridor, and change everything again. When he arrived, Lucas was already waiting near his office door, his posture alert but not urgent. That quiet tension Maigret had come to associate with unfinished business. "They sent the full record over," Lucas said, holding out a thick envelope. "Delatour's files, or rather, what little there is." Maigret took the folder and opened it as they walked in. Inside, a thin bureaucratic trail, forged identities, short-term lodging records, a few citations under false names. He flipped through slowly, stopping on a police report from Limoges, filed under Renault H, nearly 15 years old. A neighbor had reported screaming in a shared flat. No follow-up, no charges. The page was yellowing. "Do we know who lived there with him?" Maigret asked. "No tenant listed," Lucas replied. "But I had them pull the old registry book. A woman named Isabelle Fournier was staying there around that time. Her name was never connected to Delatour. She vanished in early spring." "Vanished how?" "Left no forwarding address. Didn't collect her last paycheck. Her sister filed a missing persons report a year later. Thought she'd run off with a man. The case went nowhere." Maigret closed the file. It was the same rhythm. Women who disappeared between breaths. Their names never made headlines, and their absence left no violence in the air, only an echo. He wondered how many families had consoled themselves with half-truths, the kind that kept guilt manageable. "He never buried them," Lucas added after a pause. "Not in the conventional sense. He left them where he thought they wouldn't be found. Forgotten places." "That's what he wanted," Maigret murmured. "Not to hide them, but to ensure they faded." He set the folder down and lit his pipe. The smoke curled up toward the ceiling, like something reluctant to settle. "There's something else," Lucas said. "The clerk at the Ivry storage unit remembered something odd. Said Delatour always wore gloves, even in summer. Said he handled the keys like someone afraid of leaving fingerprints." Not afraid of discovery, Maigret said. Afraid of memory. Lucas raised an eyebrow. You think he knew this would catch up to him? No, Maigret replied, but he feared being remembered for it. He wanted the power to erase, not to evade. The door opened gently, and the station typist leaned in. Inspector, there's a woman downstairs asking for you. She won't give her name. Says she's a sister. Maigret stood immediately. Bring her to the interview room. No formalities. When he entered, the woman was already seated, neatly dressed, mid-40s, with the firm stillness of someone carrying old wounds with new dignity. A handbag sat squarely in her lap, her gloved fingers curled tightly around the handles. I'm Claire Fournier, she said before he could ask. Isabelle was my sister. Maigret sat. Thank you for coming. I heard, she said, about the man. On the radio, they mentioned a pattern. Women. Gaps in records. I knew that was her story too, even if no one listened then. Maigret didn't interrupt. She met him in Limoges. I never liked him. He was watchful. That's the only word for it. You'd say something ordinary, and he'd treat it like it meant more. Made you feel like a liar even when you weren't. Isabelle said he loved her, said he was broken but gentle. Do you remember when she disappeared? It was March. She wrote me a letter 2 weeks before. Said she was tired, that she needed a clean start, but she wasn't sure how. Then she was gone. Just like that. Her landlord said she moved out, left no address. The police said adults vanish all the time. They do, Maigret said, but not without reason. Claire reached into her bag and removed a small envelope, worn and resealed several times. She slid it across the table. I kept it. Her last letter. I don't know why I brought it today. Maybe just to prove she existed. Maigret opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single page. The writing was neat, but there were ink smudges near the end, as though her hand had trembled. It read, Claire, if I do go, know that it wasn't all terrible. He made me feel seen, even if the cost was too high. I think he loved me, but he never knew how to stop holding on. If you don't hear from me, don't come looking. It means I've already made peace with the silence. Maigret folded the letter slowly. She knew, he said softly. Even then. Claire sat back, eyes glassy but dry. I used to think I should have done more, pressed harder, gone back to Limoges. Now I wonder if she'd already made her choice. She didn't choose to disappear, Maigret said. She chose not to fight what she thought she couldn't win. Claire looked at him. Will you write her name? Yes, Maigret said. In the file, in the record, and on the page they'll read in court. She nodded. That's something. When she left, Maigret stood in the hallway for a moment, letter still in hand. Lucas approached, but said nothing. Maigret spoke without turning. Add Isabelle Fournier to the list, and contact the authorities in Limoges. Ask them to revisit her building, quietly. She deserves that much. Lucas nodded and stepped away. Maigret returned to his office, opened his notebook, and wrote a single line beneath the other names. Isabelle Fournier, March, Limoges. Believed. At last. Then he set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, pipe in hand, eyes on the window where the river moved slowly under a sky that no longer promised rain. Maigret sat motionless as the afternoon sun traced a pale line across the office floor. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt tobacco and the faint chemical tang of the carbon paper Lucas had used earlier. Outside the window, traffic pulsed gently along the quay. But here, inside these four walls, time held its breath. The letter from Isabelle Fournier rested on the corner of the desk, its final line still resonating like an unfinished sentence. If you don't hear from me, don't come looking. The words weren't just resignation. They were protection, a quiet effort to spare someone else from the dark tide she'd felt pulling at her ankles. Maigret reached for his pipe, but didn't light it. He only held it between his fingers, letting the familiar shape steady his thoughts. This case, if that was even the right word for it, had become less about crime and more about memory, less about punishment and more about whether the past would be named or buried. There was a knock at the door. Lucas entered with a sheaf of notes, but his expression was different this time. Not tense, not burdened, careful maybe, watchful. "They found something in Limoges," he said, setting the folder on the desk. "A neighbor, now elderly, remembers a winter evening. Said she saw Delatour carry something wrapped in fabric down to the old coal cellar behind the building. At the time, she assumed it was furniture, maybe a carpet. It was only after hearing his name in the news that it struck her again." Maigret opened the folder. A black and white photograph clipped to the top showed a narrow courtyard. The coal chute rusted, but still intact. Beneath it, a note. "Subsurface inspection ordered. Preliminary excavation scheduled." "They're sending a forensics team tomorrow," Lucas said. "Discreetly. It'll take time." Maigret nodded once. "Let them work." "No. Press." "Of course." Lucas lingered a moment, then asked, "You think she's really there?" "She's somewhere," Maigret replied. "Whether they find her bones or only her name, she'll be brought out of silence." Lucas hesitated. "There's something else. Delatour's lawyer submitted a motion this morning. He's attempting to block the use of Delatour's verbal confession on procedural grounds. Says his client was not formally read his rights. Claims coercion." Maigret didn't sigh or grimace. He simply looked at Lucas with something close to pity. He gave it freely. "I know." He needed to speak. Lucas nodded. "But in court, men like Delatour are treated like puzzles," Maigret said. "He's not a puzzle. He's a rot that spread quietly through years and rooms and women who trusted too easily. If the confession is dismissed, then we lean on the patterns, the statements, the timeline." Lucas opened his mouth, then closed it again. Maigret stood and moved to the coat rack. "We'll go to Rue des Deux Ponts," he said. "I want to walk the building again, not as evidence, just to remember it properly." They took the car in silence. The rain had held off, though the sky was the color of dull pewter. When they arrived, the building looked smaller than Maigret remembered. Or perhaps it was simply older now, as if the truth had worn away something essential from its brick and mortar. The concierge was not at her desk. The chair was empty, the cushion flattened in the shape of her absence. A stack of unopened mail leaned precariously against the corner, and the lamp behind the counter flickered with a dying filament. Maigret moved through the hallway slowly, letting each footfall remind him of that first afternoon. The damp stones, the rusted gate, the scent, now gone but never forgotten. When he reached the end of the corridor, he stopped. The spot where Odette had lain was just bare stone now, cleaned, washed, sanitized, but nothing erases completely. He crouched there for a moment, pressing 2 fingers lightly to the floor, not to search, not to feel anything specific, only to acknowledge that something had happened here that should never have happened again. Lucas waited at a respectful distance. When Maigret rose, he looked toward the window above the stairwell. It was open again, as it had been that first day, the curtain fluttering gently, a pulse of movement in a place that had tried too long to remain still. Back at the station, a memo awaited him. The court had accepted the confession for now, pending review. The trial was to move forward, with formal charges to be filed within the week. There would be hearings, witnesses, public scrutiny. Maigret stared at the notice, then folded it and set it aside. In a drawer, he retrieved the envelope that held Odette's note, the one with Delatour's name underlined, without explanation. He unfolded it again. Just once more, and studied the loop of her handwriting. The paper was worn soft at the creases, but the ink remained dark, firm. She had written with conviction, however brief it had been. He didn't know why, but he copied the note onto a fresh sheet, word for word. No embellishment, just her voice, again. He folded it into a new envelope and sealed it. Later that evening he posted it, addressed to no one, no return, just a simple envelope deposited into the old blue box on the corner, where letters went not only to reach people, but sometimes to let something go. At home, Madame Maigret greeted him with her usual glance that asked no questions. The table was already set, a casserole kept warm in the oven. He kissed her on the cheek and poured himself a modest glass of wine. As they ate, she asked gently, "Did you finish the case?" "No," he said after a moment, "but it's done." And somewhere, beneath the dull weight of a sky that refused to change, the women whose names had almost been lost now waited to be spoken aloud, in courtrooms, in files, in quiet apartments where others might one day look at their photographs and say, "I remember her." The silence, for once, had not won. The trial was brief, understated. No press circus, no sensational testimony. The magistrate presiding over the proceedings was known for his calm demeanor and dislike of theatrics, and Delatour, for his part, offered no resistance. He entered the courtroom without a lawyer beside him, having dismissed his counsel days before, and sat without expression through the proceedings, as if watching someone else's life unfold on the page. The evidence was careful, quiet, and precise, just like the man it described. Names were spoken aloud: Odette Mercier, Léonie Daval, Isabelle Fournier, others too, unnamed, but hinted at through pattern, through witness memory, through the thread of silence that had stretched across years and regions. The confession was admitted, the handwriting matched, his travel records aligned. The jury heard no rage, no passion, no excuse, only a dull echo of loneliness and control, a need not to be seen, but to possess, fully, silently, and without end. Maigret testified only once. He spoke without flourish, detailing the shape of the investigation, the way Delatour's presence had always been, just behind the door, in the curl of smoke on a riverbank, in the soft scrape of a woman's glove against a corridor wall. He did not say he hated the man. He did not say he pitied him either. He simply told the court what he had seen, not with his eyes, but with his waiting. The verdict was delivered in under an hour. Life imprisonment, no possibility of parole. Delatour didn't react. He simply nodded once, stood, and let himself be led away, as if he had known from the start this moment would come, as if some part of him had been waiting to be named. Outside the courtroom, the sky was blue, a rare blue, clear and crisp, the kind that made the city feel like it had been freshly washed. Lucas stood beside Maigret, coat slung over one arm. "That's it, then," he said. Maigret nodded. "For now." Lucas hesitated. "Do you think he regrets it?" "No," Maigret said quietly. "But I think he understands it now. That may be worse." They walked slowly toward the river. Along the embankment, spring was beginning to touch the branches. Just a hint, just enough to notice if one was paying attention. Maigret paused beside a bench, not the one where he had first spotted Delatour, but another, facing the same slow water. He sat. Lucas remained standing. "Will you write it up yourself?" "Yes," Maigret said. "The whole thing. Not just the facts, the names, the details, what wasn't in the file." Lucas gave a small nod. "Good." Maigret reached into his coat and removed a small envelope. Inside, a photograph. Odette again. The same image, her eyes averted, her posture uncertain. He looked at it for a long time, then tucked it back into the envelope and slid it into the inner pocket of his coat. "I think people want to believe that justice is loud," he said finally. that it arrives with sirens and gavel strikes, but most of the time it's this: a bench, a quiet morning, a name that isn't forgotten. Lucas didn't reply. He didn't need to. They sat in the stillness, the water slipping by like memory. Somewhere, in a courthouse file, the names of the women had been recorded, no longer anonymous, no longer overlooked. They were not stories now. They were facts, recognized, remembered. And Maigret, as always, would carry their silence with him, not as burden, but as witness, 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 but as witness.